Inspiration can come from anywhere. A miraculous piece of nature, a chance encounter with someone special, or even just some simple kitchen prep work. But it's what we do with this inspiration that's truly beautiful. So what do you do when inspiration strikes? Well, around here, we build keyboards. Hey, what's going on, guys? It's Brainbean here again, and today we're going to be doing the first ever keyboard build on the channel. Now, this is something I've been wanting to do for a while, so we're finally going to be making it happen thanks to the folks over at Input Club and the Kono store, as well as Luxe Cables for providing their respective parts. Now, I do want to point out, again, this is my first ever build, so I did have to rely heavily on guides as well as folks like Nathan over at Teja Types. He's got some great videos, and it's a really powerful resource for people that are looking to get way more into mechanical keyboards. Some really great content to be had over there. I'm going to link his channel down in the description below. But for now, let's go ahead and take a look at what I'm calling Project Lime. As I mentioned, this is my first dive into building my own keyboard, and I highly encourage you guys to all give it a try at some point if you're interested. Now, this build did take some planning and time to get all the pieces together, so to say that I was excited to get started on this one would be a serious understatement. Before we begin, let's take a look at all the components that I'm going to be using in this build. For the casing, I'm using the Input Club WhiteFox keyboard kit. Now, this is made of machined anodized aluminum for a solid feel, and you can get the top plate in two different varieties. They have one for the TrueFox layout and one for the Aria layout, which is the one that I ended up going with. The PCB I'm using is the WhiteFox PCB. It supports 6 different layouts in single color LEDs, although I opted not to use LEDs for this build. Next, we have the switches. I'm using Hako clear switches in this build. I've used these before in my Input Club Kira, and I enjoy typing on them, which is why I decided to go with them again in this build. But I do plan on mixing it up in the future, maybe with some Holy Pandas or some Zelios switches, something like that in the next build. Hako clears are designed by Input Club, and they're sort of a fusion between Topra and Cherry MX Clear force curves, so they have an actuation force of 63 grams with a 20 gram post tactile cushion. The tactile bump isn't quite as pronounced as a Cherry Clear switch would be though, but I actually kind of like that. To top them off, I'm using the MaxkeyLime SA Double Shot ABS keycap set, which ultimately kind of set off the theme for this whole build. I really like the color and the look of these keycaps. The little pop of lime green with the grays and darker green tones on the lettering just really look nice, and I think the novelty keys look pretty good on this set too. And lastly, to tie it all together is this custom aviator cable from Luxe Cables. They made this cable for me especially for this build, and I think they did a really great job matching all the colors. Now, I'll leave links to all these components down in the description if you guys want to check them out in a little bit more detail. The first step was to lube the switches. Now, Hako clears actually come pre-lubed from the factory, but upon closer inspection, it looks like they actually only lube the area over the tactile bump, which kind of goes against normal lubing recommendations for tactile switches. I decided to re-lube these switches with Krytox 3204, and since this is my first time lubing switches, I chose 3204 since it's kind of the jack of all trades viscosity. If you've never lubed switches before, I can tell you that it's a pretty tedious process of opening each switch, separating all the parts, and carefully lubing each part, taking care to only get the lube exactly where you want it. Now, my history of painting Warhammer minis certainly helped prepare me for this task, and I highly recommend firing up a good podcast or movie to listen to in the background while you do this. It took me around 3 hours to do all 67 switches, and I'm sure with experience this can be done much faster, but I wanted to take my time with it and really get it right. Now that the switches are lubed up and ready to go, they're ready for penetrating, popping them into the top plate. This is as simple as just snapping them into place to get them ready for soldering into the PCB. Now, this was a welcome change of pace after the monotonous work with the switches, and it kind of makes it start to resemble a real keyboard. From here, I flipped the top plate over and took a look at the pins on the switches just to make sure that they were all nice and straight, and then I set this part aside for now. Before soldering, I grabbed the PCB for a quick band-aid mod. Now, this is a pretty standard mod to help dampen some of the sound of the stabilizers hitting the PCB. It's actually a really simple and effective way to reduce some of that noise, and it's as easy as cutting some cloth-backed adhesive band-aid strips and sticking them to where the stabs will hit, then coating them in some dielectric grease. After the Band-Aid mod, I went ahead and clipped and lubed the stabilizers. I'm using plate-mounted cherry stabs for this build, and this was a pretty easy step thanks to Nathan at Teja Types, who has a really great video on how to do the Band-Aid mod and clip and lube your stabs. It's just a simple matter of clipping off a few bits and then adding some dielectric grease, and you're good to go. Now that my PCB was ready to go and my stabs were nice and prepared, I grabbed the top plate again and the PCB and attempted to pop it in over the switches. This did take a couple of tries because the pins on the switches have to line up perfectly for it to go in evenly. Once that was done, I soldered the first few switches in the corners just to anchor the PCB so it would fit nicely in the case. And I should also mention that I did take out the switches for the keys that the stabilizers will go in, since those need to go in first. It did take one or two switches to really get a feel for it, but overall I think it went pretty well. On my first test, I only had one key not work, and that's because I skipped soldering one of its pins, so I'd say I'd call that a success. I should also point out that I did choose not to use LEDs on this build. I figured since the keycaps aren't translucent anyways, there really wasn't much point, and I'm not really a huge fan of having lighting under keys that don't have any shine through anyways. After soldering in most of the switches, I popped in my stabilizers and their respective switches and gave them a couple of test keystrokes before soldering those switches in place too. And man, do they sound nice and buttery. I definitely see what all the fuss is about. From this point on, it's pretty much smooth sailing. I screwed on the two aluminum legs that have their screws coming from the inside of the case out, and then put on the top plate switches and PCB into the case. A few small screws later, and it looks like a keyboard now. From here, it was on to a step that I'm actually familiar with, adding those nice MaxkeyLime keycaps. Not a whole lot to say here, as I just picked the novelty keys that I wanted and popped on the rest of the keycaps, and that's pretty much it. And last but not least, I grabbed my custom cable. Now, I think Luxe cables really nailed the color matching with the green and grays, and even the custom white aviator connector is creamy enough that it really ties in with the nice light gray on this keyboard too. And I want to make sure to say thanks to my buddy Chase over at Luxe Cables for going above and beyond for me on this one. And there you have it. From there, it was just a matter of flashing the keyboard and setting the layout that I wanted in the firmware. And that's it. My first ever build was complete. I won't keep you guys waiting, as the first thing that I did was start typing away and soaking up the feel of freshly lubed switches with smooth modded stabs. So here is the moment you guys have been waiting for, that delicious sound test. And that's it for the build. I mean, I'm really excited with how this thing turned out. It is beyond my wildest expectations for the first go around, and I think everything ties in really nicely. If you guys are considering doing this, I highly recommend it. There's tons of resources out there like the ones I linked below for you, and it's just a really rewarding process, very similar to how it is to getting into PC gaming and then building your own PC. Very similar kind of transition here, where you get into mechanical keyboards and then the natural progression is to build your own keyboard, which I highly recommend you guys all give it a shot. Well, that's it for the video, guys. Overall, I really enjoyed this process, and it came out a lot better than I was expecting it to, and I'm really looking forward to bringing you guys even more build videos coming up here in the future. So let me know down in the comments below if you have anything in particular that you would like to see. Otherwise, make sure you click that like button and hit that subscribe button so you don't miss out on any more videos from me. You don't miss out on those future build videos. But anyways, guys, that's it. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next one.